Hello, welcome to this special discussion that we're having at Reform Judaism in honor of LGBT plus History Month. I'm delighted that I'm Rabbi Daniel Lichman, and I'm delighted to be joined by Alma Reisel and Rabbi Jonathan Magonet. And we're going to be reflecting on the life of Rabbi Lionel Blue. Lionel Blue passed away in 2016. In early February, he would have had his 91st birthday. Lionel was able to see a lot of the progress that was made around LGBT inclusion in the Jewish community. And there's other progress that's been made since then that he would have been delighted. We're sure that he would have been delighted to see. I'm really excited that we're going to get to talk about Rabbi Lionel Blue, who's been an important influence on me. I continue to be inspired by him. And I'm just really excited that we're going to get to be able to tell more people, those of you who are listening, about him. So I think maybe we could just begin if I ask you, Alma, and then Jonathan, if you could tell us a little bit about how you knew him. So Alma, would you like to go first?
Sure. For me, Lionel was family. I grew up with him. He'd been friends with my grandparents and my parents, and he was always a part of my life with his partner, Jim, who he loved very, very much. And I feel very privileged that I got to have an extra grandpa in Lionel and in Lionel and Jim as a pair, and to grow up with their love for each other and their love for us as a part of my life from as early as I can remember.
Great. Thank you, Alma. And Rabbi Jonathan.
Yes, Lionel came into my life when I was part of the Reform Youth Movement, the YSGB. And Lionel came to some of the summer schools and spoke about the in-depth religious experience that was part of his personal life and so on. And it made me be aware of just how empty the movement was at the time of any kind of spirituality. So I decided to leave. About that time, Lionel came to me together with Rabbi Dov Marmor and said, look, Lionel's the new European director of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. We need someone to take over the chairmanship just for a few months of the youth section while we wind it up. And being flattered by being approached by these two worthies, I said, yes, of course. And for the next 2.5 years, I schlepped around Europe with Lionel, working on youth conferences, trying to attract young people to the rabbinate, and doing our bit towards rebuilding post-war European Jewry. And that was my connection with Lionel in the first instance.
So as we continue the conversation, I'm curious to start with a question for you, Jonathan. So you edited multiple prayer books with Lionel, and you also collaborated with him on other works as well. I'm curious to ask you, in the process of editing the prayer books, was there a way in which Lionel's experience as a gay man came into your work together and into the work that he brought to the prayer books?
Yes and no. Lionel was very reluctant to actually, in those early years, to actually go public in any kind of way. I did it slightly for him because I smuggled into the study anthology of the High Holy Day Prayer Book a piece by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was the famous sort of the first to explore the realities of sexual life and particularly of homosexuality. He was himself gay, Magnus Hirschfeld, known, Lionel told me affectionately, as Tanta Magnolia. And his Center for the Study of Sexuality was the first thing the Nazis closed when they came to power. So he was a real historic figure in that area. And I put a piece of his into the anthology of the prayer book just to make sure that presence was there. This was back in 85, I think it was. But Lionel himself was very to keep it a secret in the early years. And I remember he told me the first time he told me was I was driving him somewhere where he was going to do a service. And he casually mentioned that he was gay. And I'm driving and sort of thinking, yes, thank you. But it never it wasn't a problem in that sense. But knowing about it meant that it was a secret I had to keep in all sorts of public situations for many, many years to come. If I just maybe say one thing about that as well, the argument about gay people was that they were immoral in some sense. And knowing Lionel's story and his suffering because of that, it seemed to me the only immorality was the way that gay people were being treated. And that was something which was so important for me in just thinking about the whole issue.
Yeah, and in that, Jonathan, as I recall that you, this is I guess before my time, but I was able to read this afterwards. You edited the volume on Jewish explorations of sexuality at some point, and there were various other things that you did as principal of the college that really enabled the progress to be made around this issue. So I'm curious if Lionel, I imagine that Lionel must have been a big influence on that process and what you were able to do as someone who was a kind of ally, supportive of this cause.
Yes, only because Lionel was clearly unique, special, and gay, and any critique of the whole issue immediately came back to, what does this mean to someone like Lionel? And are we excluding whole sections of the community on this sort of for this very peculiar reason? Why are we acting immorally towards such people? So in a very quiet sort of way, it seemed to me this was something which we had to address, particularly at the college. And when two women came forward and said, we are lesbian and we want to study at the college, I wasn't yet principal, which was fortunate because I could argue on their behalf. It was a long story that we had to go through of a number of years trying to resolve that challenge which came to us. But in the end, we succeeded. And against many odds against it too. We lost a number of patrons of the college because they were upset that we were prepared to accept a couple of homosexual women, of lesbian women. So it was a struggle, but one just did it. It seemed to me it was the right thing to do. So we took that stand.
Well, Jonathan, I want to honour you for your role and your work as an ally in doing that, and what a difference that made. And it's interesting to reflect on the on you knowing Lionel and his experience, and you being really aware of him as a person, and what that meant for the positions that you took publicly. And that's very interesting to reflect on. I mean, that connects me to ask Alma a question as well. I know that one of the things that you've done over the last few years and have been incredibly successful with is being a trustee of Keshet UK and being a part of a small group of people that's taken Keshet UK from being something very tiny to something that's actually pretty influential and has had a big impact. I'm curious to ask you, Alma, whether your knowing Lionel had an impact on your work with Keshet UK.
I think so. I think knowing Lionel from such an early age and kind of having grandparent figures who are gay is something that, because of the difficulties in being open and leading an open life that Lionel's generation had, not that many people had that luxury or that kind of special experience of these wonderful people in their lives as in that sort of family grandparental role. And so it just, I grew up seeing Lionel and Jim being in love and hilarious together, and the way that they supported each other, and they were so different, but there was just such a strength to their commitment, and the way that Jim would be at every one of Lionel's events, kind of selling books and supporting him, even though it was really not his world or his interest, but he just loved Lionel and Lionel loved him. And I think having had that in my life, then realizing or kind of growing up and discovering that some people had a problem with that was very, very shocking, because it was so obvious that was a force for good in the world. To have that sort of love in the world is healing, is positive, is beautiful, is a great example. And the idea that anyone would think that this was a problem was very confusing to me growing up. And then when I was 12, I had a school project to do a biography of somebody in my life, and I picked Lionel. And so I spent some time interviewing Lionel in his living room, and he was incredibly generous with his time, talking about his experiences. And I, very studiously put together and wrote up all of Lionel's accounts. And I remember him telling me stories of being blackmailed by people who knew that he was gay before he had wanted to share that publicly. And he also told me a story of one woman in a community that he was in who'd fallen in love with him and tried to tell everyone that they were in a relationship, which wasn't true. But then he was faced with a dilemma, because if he explained that he was gay, then people would understand that hadn't happened. But he didn't know, he felt that it would cost his job either way. right? Either people would believe he'd had this affair and that would cost him a job, or if he shared with the community that he was gay, he was worried that that would cost him a job. And those sorts of dilemmas, kind of discussing that with Lionel, had a huge impact on my understanding of this history and how far we'd already come, but how much more there was still to do. I think just having Lionel in my life made it very obvious that we had to do this work all together, and it was on all of us to make sure that people like Lionel, like what a loss to the community if Lionel hadn't felt able to be a part of it. And that's been a big motivator for me in the work with Keshet UK, that actually we just miss out on so much if we don't enable all of our community to feel themselves, to feel valued, welcomed, supported, able to lead, able to teach others. And the idea that there could have been Reform Judaism without Lionel's influence, it would be much poorer for it.
Thank you, Alma. I recall that there was a Keshet UK event which you arranged for Lionel to come and speak at, and it was a very moving thing to see Lionel there at the event speaking.
Yeah. So that was Keshet UK has had an annual Hanukkah reception in Parliament since 2013. And the very first one, Lionel was our guest speaker. And he was there with Jim. And it was incredibly moving. And I remember Lionel saying, he was very moved and saying he couldn't quite believe that we'd got to this moment, that he had dreamed of an experience like that, but didn't think it would happen in his lifetime, that he could be in a place like Parliament, celebrating his Jewish identity and celebrating his gay identity and celebrating them both at the same time. He said was truly a Hanukkah miracle. And he said, he kind of led us all in saying the Shechianu prayer, thanking God for having sustained him, sustained us, and kept him alive for that moment. And he also remembered all of those who didn't make it to that moment, whose lives were lost on the way, both to AIDS and also to suicide. And that there were many for whom the struggle had been too much. And he thought of them in that moment that we were celebrating, which felt like a very Jewish approach, a bit like breaking the glass under the chuppah, to say, even in our kind of joyful, happy moments, just to remember the journey and the people who weren't there to celebrate. And it was a really beautiful event. And Lionel led us in Ma'atzor and in kind of celebrating Hanukkah and celebrating together that we'd got to the point that the Jewish community could proudly celebrate our LGBT plus members.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And the thinking about Lionel's appearance there reminds me of other kind of public moments where he was able to be an elder figure who celebrated being Jewish and being gay. And one of the things, he spoke a few times at Pride Shabbatot that I attended. And when he was there, he used to recall a story of an experience that he had from going to Amsterdam and being in gay saunas there. And he's written it up in some of his books as well. So I actually just want to read from one of Lionel's books so that we get some of his words around this. And what he wrote here that I'm going to read out, when he shared it in these public forums, it was something that was very powerful for LGBT people to hear him say these words. So I'm going to turn to his words, which is in his book, God Seeker's Guide. In the sauna, I had a religious experience and found that God had unexpectedly followed me. He had come with my luggage and was surprisingly vocal and practical, which the clerics I had met were not. After a mild orgy, rather like a sexual rugger scrum, I cried out in anger, "Is this all it's about? A little light relief and that's it?" The unexpected answer came from on high, from within, and it gobsmacked me. "Lionel," it said, "you don't get much because you don't give much. What are the rules for me here in a friendly, permissive sauna for gay men of the older sort, just like ones I like?" I asked. "What are the 10 commandments of my new situation?" The following was revealed to me. Don't do the night before what you're going to regret the morning after. If you make an appointment to meet someone, keep it, even if you've met someone more attractive between times. If the person you're going to say no to is an oldie, be especially considerate. Remember, if you're lucky, you might become an oldie too. Don't flee like a scolded cat from someone you've just made love to. It's demeaning for the other person as well as for you. Love and sex need good manners and affection, not rejection. Don't hand out blank checks on the affections you can't cash or dates for meetings you won't keep. In Bohemia, the difference between heaven and hell is trust. It's fragile, keep it. So that's an example of I think that captures something very like Lionel, where it's really kind of clear talking, very truthful, something a kind of like playful, funny style, kind of folksy even, which yet contains something very profound within it. Earlier, when you were speaking, Jonathan, you talked about how Lionel didn't bring explicitly into his work with the prayer book his identity, and yet for me, when I read the prayers, that either the prayers I know that he wrote or ones that through their tone and style that are unattributed, I also know that he wrote because of what they evoke. There's something I have experienced from reading them that tells me of the isolation that he's experienced at different points and the kind of particular struggles that he's had, which as I read them, I can read into it the spiritual experience of someone who's struggled in the way that Lionel had. So yeah, I was just reflecting on how his legacy within our prayer books. I do see that experience he had as a gay man enabling the depth that he offers. I'm curious, Jonathan, what you think of that.
Yes, I mean, I fully agree. I know what he managed to do, of course, was to translate his personal experience into a general experience, a very human experience, and that was what makes the prayer books work so well. In fact, you suddenly, in the middle of all of the formal ritualistic materials, which are several hundred thousands or so years old, which have a very clear, or appear to have a very clear sense of Jewish identity, purpose, divine engagement, and so forth. Lionel suddenly introduces a very personal, but very simple personal sort of experience, which made him so successful on the radio and so on. It was a kind of an ability to show his own mistakes and faults and absurdities, but not specifically because he was gay. But I think the fact of his being gay and being sort of an outsider in that sense, or as he would say, a doubly an outsider, sometimes as a Jew, as a gay person, always outside the majority sort of world. That comes across without it being tied to LGBT sort of reality. It's a human reality. And I think that's what he brought also in our world, to interfaith dialogue. One of the problems is that if you meet people officially as official Jews, official Christians, official Muslims, you're trapped inside those sort of systems. But the individual person you come to meet is the one who makes you realize that we are who we are. Our relationship is much more fluid and a very different kind of thing. So the religious identity becomes secondary to the reality of another human being sharing similar kinds of a similar life, similar world. Whether the lifestyle is the same or different doesn't really matter. And that was for me something which was quite transforming, I think, in my own way of reading. Lionel and I sort of we worked on these prayer books and we struggled like cat and dog because we were temperamentally totally different. Lionel was intuitive and very impatient with the traditional material, which didn't speak to you immediately, was his argument. And I was terrified of changing any single word of the tradition because, this weight of stuff was on top of me. And it took me a long time to relax. And it was only because Lionel finally persuaded me, but I actually wrote some prayers myself, which were eventually included. But you can, if you look at the old Siddur now, you can tell the difference between Lionel's prayers and mine. Mine are sort of rigorously structured, point A, B, and C. Lionel's just sort of flowed together. So it was, but that's what made the prayer book successful in the end. It was the difference of our temperaments. And by the time we got to the second and third ones, we sort of knew what the other one was doing, and we were answering ahead of time what the other one would have expected.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks for that, Jonathan. We'll begin closing the conversation. So I'm curious to ask Alma for any kind of final thoughts or reflections, and then go back to Jonathan for that as well.
I I think hearing what Rabbi Jonathan Magonet was just saying about kind of making his personal experience universal in a way, kind of finding ways to connect it to everyone. I think one of Lionel's kind of special, amazing, beautiful qualities was the way that he could make anybody feel accepted and see them and validate them and show kindness and love. And he kind of engulfed you in this this warmth and love, whoever you were. And I think he had a special reservoir of love and kindness reserved for anyone who felt out of place for whatever reason. Anyone who felt that they were not able to conform, that they were not the same, that in some way they might not be welcome, whether that was people in relationships with those who weren't Jewish, whether that was people who were LGBT plus, whether that was people whose politics was opposed to the mainstream. Lionel really made a special kind of reach out effort to say those people on the margins are important, beautiful, and we need to make sure that they are loved and a part of our community. But he did it for everyone. Whoever crossed Lionel's path, even at the end of his life in the hospital, the nurses, the people who do the cleaning around his bed, whoever it was who crossed Lionel's path, he would make feel a little bit better about themselves and give them that kind of strength or capacity to be kinder to the next person they met. And I think if we can all adopt that approach, because there's still so much work we have to do in inclusion, I think if we can adopt a bit of Lionel's approach in doing that, we'll get a lot further, a lot faster.
Yes, I'm aware of Jonathan, you being involved in some key moments in the reform movement, learning about how to be inclusive of LGBT people. So publishing Jewish Explorations of Sexuality was an important moment. Your work in the college as well on being an activist to campaign for the ordination of the first two out lesbian women who were at the college. In some ways, the history of Reform Judaism with inclusion is also a bit checkered, in the sense that in the late 90s, the debates around having same-sex commitment ceremonies got quite nasty in many ways. It was a moment in time where a lot of homophobia within the reform movement was revealed, and I think that's quite important to acknowledge, that it's not been a straightforward history in any way. Much like I guess Reform Judaism reflects the world around it as well, and the kind of debates in the world around it took place in this organization as well. Right now, though, I think we can celebrate that we're at a moment where most synagogues in the reform movement will do same-sex weddings. So we're at a moment where it does feel like it's there's been real progress made. So I'm curious to ask you, Alma, what your sense is of that. What else is there to still be done?
So I think hearing from Rabbi Jonathan Magonet about that history, and I think that was how it was for a long time, that individuals had to be incredibly brave in saying, this is me, I am gay, I am lesbian, I am queer, this is who I am. Will you make your synagogue, your organization, a space that I can be and I can live my life and practice my Judaism? And I think the pressure now has shifted up from individuals onto institutions to make ourselves ready and say, okay, what can we as a synagogue, what can we as a movement, what can we as a college, wherever it is, do to make sure that nobody has to ask that question, right? That actually it's already set up in a way that is valuing every member, supporting every person who wants to be a part of our institution. And Reform Judaism's come a long way, and we can hear that thinking about Lionel's experience and comparing it to now, when Pride Shabbat is a part of most Reform synagogue calendars and is celebrated, and in our cheders and in RSY-Netzer, there's a really celebratory attitude towards diversity, inclusion, celebrating and valuing our membership. But there's still a lot of work to do, and I think there's work to do in terms of making sure that people don't feel that they've become a token, and that their experience is kind of being paraded around without necessarily that being what they'd asked for. And so we need to make sure that people are able to live and be themselves, and those that want to be leaders and speak about their experience can and should. But if that's not what you want, that should also be absolutely fine. And sometimes we might find our young people or others very angry that our movement isn't where they want it and need it to be. And that anger sometimes can be responded to with defensiveness, because we're rightly proud of the history and proud of the progress. And then it can feel like, but we're doing so much. And actually, I think if we can shift that and see that anger, that frustration, as a vote of confidence, that actually I'm only going to be angry and shout at you if I think there's a chance you're going to do anything. Otherwise, I'm just going to walk away. And so I think if we can hear those critiques, however they're expressed, with the kind of kindness, sensitivity, and openness that Lionel modeled in his life, then I think we'll be able to really make strides to where we all want to be in terms of being a truly celebratory, inclusive community.
Thanks, Alma. And Jonathan, would you like anything that you'd like to say? By way of
yes, just to remember that Lionel was a very irritating kind of person to travel with, because I was always an hour early for any meeting of any sort. Lionel was always at the last minute was looking for something which he'd forgotten about, and so that was another way in which we irritated each other enormously. But I just wanted to end with what I wrote about him once. I wrote a song about my teachers, and Lionel was the first on the list of people. And I was influenced by a poem by a Polish poet about the seventh angel, who is not like the others, but who smuggles sinners into heaven. And that to me became such a good description of Lionel and various other people who were my religious teachers. And in the song about Lionel, I was also quite blunt about it. It goes, it isn't nice to see the way the prophet eats. He tends to dribble, and he's far too fond of sweets. But when it matters, he's the one who never cheats, and you may never see his like again. And Lionel liked it very much and was happy with it.
Great. Thank you to both of you. I've got many reflections from this conversation. Something I was thinking about going into talking with the two of you about this was how I really think that for me to go back and revisit Lionel's writings and to think about his life is something that I know will give me a lot of strength in my work as a rabbi. I was reflecting on how I'm working as a congregational rabbi at this point, and how that was something that it was hard for Lionel as a gay man to be a congregational rabbi in the period that he was working, and he went on to do other things. Maybe partly as a result, I'm not sure, but it was a difficult, as Alma explained through the story that you told. So I'm thinking about his legacy and what I can learn from it. And I also think it's really an honor to talk with both of you, because both of you have done powerful work through, Alma with Keshet UK, Jonathan with the college, and in other aspects in Reform Judaism. And earlier, before we started recording, Jonathan showed us a booklet from 1982 that he was involved in the creation of, called Jewish and Homosexual, which was a really early and quite groundbreaking moment where Reform Judaism was ahead of its times around seeking to be inclusive of gay people. And I think what I'm reflecting on from the two of you and Lionel as well is that one thing that it's possible to critique Lionel for, and certainly people in the 1980s might have done this, would be to say that he wasn't enough of an activist, or that he didn't kind of like come out early on and kind of like be an activist in that way, and yet what I see is just the different kinds of activism there are. What he did was quietly being himself and being honest and true and living with integrity and being clear with the people that knew him about who he was and what he was. And through that, he was able to make a ripple effect that led to all kinds of changes taking place. And it just reminds me of the different kinds of activism that's available. There's the possibility of being out, waving flags, being loud, being confrontational, and that's really important. There's also the possibility of being quiet, of being publicly quiet and being subtle in your messages that go out publicly, and being really true and having integrity and having honesty and allowing things to arise through love and goodness. And that's something that I think Lionel really represents. So I want to say thank you to both of you, to Alma and to Rabbi Jonathan, for talking with me today. It's a really special thing to remember and to honor Lionel Blue, and to think of Lionel Blue within this context of LGBT history.
Thank you.